brought to you courtesy of the red, white, and blue.
Hey guys, happy Thursday, November 12th. I'm not with you today. Sorry I couldn't be there, but I wanted to make sure that you got to see my face and charming personality, at least for a little bit. So today we're going to kind of finish up Andrew Jackson, and the way I'd like to think of today is we're discussing Jackson's legacy. Why does Jackson matter? Why does Jackson get an entire era named after him? The age of Jackson. So let's kind of zoom out a little bit, big picture. On the Google Classroom from Tuesday, check that, Monday's post, you'll see two different Google Docs of notes. One is entitled Andrew Jackson Politics, the other one's Jackson Conflicts. So let's talk about Jackson. Again, he is during period 4, 1800 to 1848, which I have nicknamed for you guys the age of Jefferson through the age of Jackson. And it's very appropriate because if you think about it, this time period, if we're doing contextualization, trying to get that point on an essay, those two guys define the time period. Jefferson's Revolution of 1800 kicks it off. His 2 terms in office are then followed by the 2 terms of Madison and Monroe, or what we like to call the Virginia Dynasty. It's during those Monroe years that we see one of our biggest changes. We see the end of the 2-party system, or what's called the era of good feelings. I'm not going to rehash that. We've talked about that enough. But then we see another change. The recreation of that 2-party system in 1824. So let's pick up with that. Why do we care about Andrew Jackson? Because Jackson, you can argue, is the right guy in the right place at the right time. Yes, he's known as the president of the common man. They often call the age of Jackson the era of the common man. And to his credit, Jackson does, at least in his mind, stick up for people he thinks are the underdogs. Reference the Margaret Eaton affair. She was a woman of common background, although did have a scandalous past. And Jackson, when he made decisions, would defend them, saying, I'm doing what I think is in the interest of the common people. Why does he do that? Well, for one thing, voting rights change. And we'll have a map popping up here in a second if my producer, director, cameraman John's doing his job. And that map is going to show electoral college votes in 1824. So understand, as you get manifest destiny, as you go west, young man, go west, and you increase the number of states, those states are going to change how voting is done. There's a historian I would like you to know. Cameraman John, I hope you're going to get me a picture of this guy. His name is Frederick Jackson Turner. He's one of the most important historians that we talk about in American history. He comes later on. He writes what's called the Frontier Thesis. And Turner's big idea is that, look, the fact that we always had a West is what shaped America. The West made us more democratic. The West made us more innovative. The West made us more resourceful. So it's the Western states who are the first ones to change suffrage laws, to change voting laws. It's the Western states who first adopt the idea of universal male suffrage. And that's one of the biggest trends. Star that, highlight it, circle it. That is for contextualization in period 4 in general, and Jackson's era in particular, the money term, universal male suffrage. This idea that as time goes on, more and more, now let's qualify this, white males can vote. See, states begin to remove the property qualification for voting, starting with the Western states. No longer do you have to be a male who's white, of such an age, and own property. Now they remove that property qualification, which means common folk can vote. The other thing that you see is, during this time period, states change how they dole out their electoral college votes. The Constitution itself basically just says, look, states will choose electors. And originally the way it worked simply was your state government would pick people to represent you in the electoral college. But now you begin campaigning, and whoever wins the popular vote gets those electoral college votes for that state, kind of like we do today. So now not only can the common man vote, but his vote actually actually matters. Now, of course, we do realize that the popular vote doesn't elect the president. The Electoral College does. And you must get a majority in the Electoral College, as Andrew Jackson learned the hard way in 1824. We see some other changes. Political parties start to open up the process of how they pick their candidates. Prior to the age of Jackson, we had what was called the King Caucus system. And the way the King Caucus system worked was you had a bunch of party leaders sitting in some back room somewhere going, all right, here's the deal. This is the guy we're picking for our party. So if you were a member of a political party, a rank and file member, you didn't get a say. Now all of a sudden political parties start to hold nominating conventions where members can come together, they can air things out, they can voice their opinions, and that's what we still see today, this idea of nominating conventions. Another big change for Jackson is the idea of actively and aggressively running for political office. We talk about Jackson's campaign style, and my crafty cameraman John, he's going to put up a picture of a guy named Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren's a New Yorker. They call him the Wizard of Kinderhook, they call him the Little Magician. He, in 1824 and 1828, is Jackson's campaign manager. And Van Buren later on will become Jackson's Secretary of State, later Vice President, later he'll be President, although for one term. Van Buren is a political whiz kid. The equivalent today, when we get into period 9, would be James Carville, who was the campaign manager for Bill Clinton, hypothetically speaking, of course, and a guy named Karl Rove, who was campaign manager for George W. Bush. It's Van Buren who popularizes the whole idea of the politician going out, shaking hands, kissing babies, passing out buttons, having songs, slogans, parades. When Jackson comes into town, there's going to be a Jackson campaign rally, little kids marching the parade holding hickory sticks because he's old hickory, and they have barrels of hard cider and other kinds of booze because there ain't no party like a Jackson party, and a Jackson party don't stop. Now, don't forget, again, if we're talking about legacy, the importance of Jackson's defeat, that corrupt bargain of 1824. It's the first of several times where the guy who wins the popular vote does not get elected president. Jackson not only won the popular vote, if you remember, he had most of the Electoral College votes, but not a majority in 1824. And that's how he lost, because of that corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. But we'll see this idea that in the flaw of the Electoral College, one guy can win the popular vote but not the electoral vote. We'll see it in 1824. We'll see it again in 1876. We'll see it again in 1888. We will see it in 2000. We will see it in 2016. And if you don't like the Electoral College, the only thing you can do is you have to ratify an amendment because it's a part of the Constitution. Now, go back to this idea of Jacksonian democracy. It's not just about his campaign style. Jackson tries to talk the talk and walk the walk in office. My favorite story that I couldn't properly act out to you because of our current predicament involved his inaugural party. Now, President-elect Biden on January 20th, 2021 will be sworn in as 46th President of the United States, and there will be inaugural balls in Washington. Now, they'll be very dialed down, I'm guessing, this year because of our COVID situation, if they happen at all. But typically speaking, in past years, the First Lady would wear several dresses. Dress designers would basically say, here, please, we'll give you this dress to borrow, please wear it. Jewelers would say, please, can you wear our fancy jewelry? And they're big time affairs. Only the party elite, only the rich and snobby can go. Not Andrew Jackson. On his inauguration day in 1829, remember, Jackson's election was called the Revolution of 1828. Similar to how Jefferson had a revolution in 1800. Jackson's revolution is a little different. It's not just a change in political party to the Democrats, but it's also a change in geography. Jackson's the first Western president. He's also the first president of common ancestry, common heritage. He grew up poor. So Jackson says, look, the White House is the people's house. And as such, he throws the doors of the White House open, baby. And every goober, hillbilly, redneck hick, I'm going to tell you something right now. It makes an SU frat party, an SU toga party, look like a bunch of nuns sitting around playing Monopoly.
Toga, 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 toga.
It gets crazy. People are drunk. They are trashing the White House. It gets to be so bad that the White House staffers, the butlers, the maids, and everybody, they take all the booze. They put it outside on the front lawn and they go, "Hey, drunken hillbilly sloppy redneck Uber people. Yeah, Uncle Si, Duck Dynasty guys, yeah, come outside. We got more room out here for you guys to get sloppy drunk and stuff." And when everybody goes outside staggering after the booze, they lock the White House doors. This is your president. Yeah. So now, I told you last class how Jackson had spittoons installed in the White House so people could get their big old wad of tobacco in their, spit into their spittoons, hopefully accurately. I told you how Jackson had the first presidential assassination attempt and darn near assassinated the assassin. Now that comes from one of the ways Jackson tries to reorganize government. Again, we can assess, we can criticize Jackson, but we can point to at least policies that do try to increase the power of the common person. One is the spoils system, where Jackson plays that patronage game, good vocab word, big time. Jackson comes in, he fires the officials appointed by John Quincy Adams. Now I'm not just talking cabinet members, but I'm talking postmasters, customs officials, those rank and file government positions. And Jackson says, I'm putting my people in. Now, when you put people into government jobs because they were loyal, they worked for your campaign, or they donated money, that doesn't mean they're qualified. One Jackson appointee embezzled a ton of money from the U.S. government, and they had to track him down overseas and have him arrested. Jackson, as part of the spoils system, also believed in this idea of rotation in office. So, hey, Bubba, I'm going to make you postmaster of that little town because you said you want to learn how to read them letters. But you only get one term. And then rotation in office. I'm going to put somebody else in there. Jackson said, look, it's the people's government. People should have access to government jobs. Now, we heard about the disaster, the Margaret Eaton scandal. Remember, Jackson politics is personal politics. That's why he goes all wiki when the cabinet members and their wives won't play nice with the Eaton family. But it's also because he sees his wife there, a woman of common heritage who's being shamed and shunned by people who are rich and powerful. Jackson does not really trust his cabinet. He hires and fires cabinet members like crazy, goes through like 3 different secretaries of state, 4 secretaries of the Treasury, and so on and so forth. So he comes to rely more and more upon this kitchen cabinet, those advisors he sneaks in through the back door of the White House. That ties in, though, to this idea of Jacksonian democracy and the common man. Jackson, he brings in newspaper writers, especially from Western states, and says, so tell me, what do people care about? What do people want to hear? Okay, let me bounce an idea off you. Now these reporters, they get an inside scoop on stories. Jackson gets free speechwriters. Today, we call these guys the White House advisors. Not cabinet officials, but presidents typically have writers, they have lawyers, non-government type guys who help them do their job. Alright, so we talked about scandals with Peggy Eaton. We talked about the nullification crisis. Remember, Jackson politics are personal politics. John Calhoun made the big mistake in assuming that Jackson would back South Carolina's bid for nullification because Jackson, yes, typically was a states' rights guy. Jackson thought he was a wannabe Jefferson. Calhoun forgot the part that Jackson hated him. So South Carolina refused to pay the federal tariff. A big debate happens in the Senate. A term you really need to know, it's called the Webster-Hayne debate. Hayne is a senator from South Carolina. He talks about states' rights and secession. Well, Daniel Webster, he's a guy we're going to talk about quite a bit in the next month and change. Daniel Webster is a northern senator, and he is a braggart, a blowhard, a lawyer by trade, a gambler. He's full of himself. He likes to give long speeches. Now, how do I want to say this nicely? He gives really long speeches. Webster would be known to go on and speak for hours and hours and hours on a topic, like in a manner of like a Shakespearean actor. So during these Webster-Hayne debates, Hayne argues the cause of states' rights, and when it's Webster's turn, he gives two, pause for dramatic effect, wait for it, two-day speech in which he says the Union cannot be dissolved, like in his famous line is, like a rope of sand. And at the end he says, you know, liberty and union now and forever. Well, Jackson responds like only Jackson can. He goes into general mode. He gets Congress to pass a force bill authorizing him to send the army to South Carolina.
Use the force, Luke.
He threatens to mobilize 100,000 troops. He threatens to hang everybody in South Carolina, starting with, you guessed it, Calhoun. And before it actually hits the fan, who comes in and saves the day? Da-da-da-da! Captain Compromise, Henry Clay, who gets a compromise tariff, a lower tariff passed. South Carolina can save face by saying, ha, we made you Yankees do something, and Jackson could say, yeah, but you paid it. Again, we talked about the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Jackson, as a Westerner, he's pro-states' rights. This is during the time period of the Market Revolution, and cotton, which again depletes the soil, cotton causes Southerners to move west, and it becomes the impetus for forcing natives off their land. Now let's talk about Jackson's Indian policy. Look at his background. The guy was a general in the War of 1812 and was a general who primarily fought in the Tennessee militia, fought against different Native American groups. He had a reputation as an Indian fighter. In 1830, Jackson's Congress, and I do say Jackson's Congress because they really were like, yes sir, Mr. President, sir, passed the Indian Removal Act. That Indian Removal Act of 1830 is an important term. Essentially the idea was, we're going to create a Bureau of Indian Affairs, and this was the reading that you did for Zinn for today. And basically said, we're going to forcibly relocate the remaining tribes that are east of the Mississippi out west into then what was called Indian Territory. Today we call it Oklahoma. Now the title of that Zinn chapter, As Long as Grass Grows or Water Runs, that was Jackson's promise to the Cherokee. Oh, I will give you the land west of the mighty Mississippi. It will be yours as long as grass grows or water runs. Of course, we know that's not going to be the truth, that as the United States moves further west, Native Americans who have already been displaced are going to continue to be displaced. Alright, last thing I want to talk about for Jackson, let me talk about his legacy and what it means, why he's important, is his war with the bank. If you want to kind of get a little snapshot of Andrew Jackson on in his mindset that I'm on a mission for the people, but also on his dangerous kind of behavior, it's this bank war. Envision the Monopoly man, except fatter. That's Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle is the guy who runs the second bank in the United States. It's located on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. It is a brick building with a marble facade on the front, and Biddle is the stereotypical, you can hear my dog Ruby, she's all excited. Biddle is the stereotypical wealthy, big business type of guy. Now, Biddle runs the bank exceptionally well. The bank is tight-fisted with how much money they print out. They are tight when it comes to how much credit they give, which is always going to favor the Eastern businessman, the businessman, the merchant, and it's always going to hurt the Western farmer or the Southern planter. Okay? Now, in 1832, there's a new political party looking to oppose Andrew Jackson, the Whig Party. What happens is the Whigs in 1832, they're going to nominate Henry Clay. Henry Clay, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. Guy runs for president 3 times. And they decide they want to show that Jackson's reckless, he'll destroy the economy. So on July 4th, 1832, the Whigs, who control Congress at the time, present to Jackson a bill to recharter, to renew the charter for the second bank of the United States. Although it's not going to expire for like another 5 years. Because they know what Jackson's going to do. Jackson vetoes it. The Whigs think, ha, we got him. We can make this the campaign issue. Jackson's reckless. You know, he's going to crash the economy. He's going to cause all kinds of problems. But it backfires. Word gets out that Nicholas Biddle and the National Bank donated a substantial amount of money to Clay's campaign. Biddle and the bank like to flex and kind of meddle in politics too. Jackson says, I'm fighting a war for the people against what he called the 7-headed hydra of corruption. And the American people, think back to that cult of personality thing, they go, yeehaw, old Hickory! That's right, Jackson's sticking up for us against the bank. Jackson wins in a landslide. Now kids, there's certain things we don't do in life. You don't tug on Superman's cape, you don't spit into the wind, and you don't start some with Andrew Jackson. Now that Jackson's been reelected, he says to himself, Self, I'm going to end the National Bank. I'm going to choke the life out of it. He tells his Secretary of the Treasury, remove all of the federal deposits from the bus. Now here's the deal about the Second National Bank. It was not technically a government agency. It was a semi-private institution. It just happened that the national government was the largest depositor. So Jackson says, basically, remove all of the federal government's money, put them into state banks, or what are called, wait for it, pet banks.
Do you mind explaining this? That is a bad kitty. Bad.
Jackson's Secretary of the Treasury says, Mr. President, that's nuts. I won't do that. You'll destroy the economy. So Jackson says, you're fired. Secretary of Treasury number 2 comes in. I ain't doing that. You're fired. Secretary of the Treasury number 3 comes in. You're fired. Secretary of the Treasury number 4, a guy named Roger Taney. T-A-N-E-Y. Know that name. He's gonna become notorious. And I don't mean like B.I.G. Taney from Maryland says, yes sir, Mr. President, I sure will, it's a good idea. And they put the money from the national bank into the pet banks or state banks. Now, these banks are more popular in the western states because they print out more money. This is a time of manifest destiny. Go west, young man, go west. People want to buy western land. There's a big western land rush. So the banks are printing out money like it's nobody's business. They're printing out more money. Now back then, your paper money had to be backed by gold or silver. They're printing out more money than they can back. They're giving out loans that are dangerous. The U.S. economy starts to get in trouble. Jackson in 1836, his last full year in the White House, says, all right, we're going to stop this. He issues what is called the Specie Circular, in which he says, look, if you want to buy western land, you got to pay for it with hard currency, hard silver coins or gold coins. So what happens? These people go back to the pet banks and they go, yeah, I want to exchange my paper money for silver or gold. And the pet banks are kind of like, yeah, we don't got that. And so what happens? The Panic of 1837.
Remain calm. All is well. All is well.
People run to the banks. These pet banks collapse. The U.S. economy goes in the dumper. Who just happens to be leaving office at that time? Old Hickory. Who doesn't get blamed? You know it, Old Hickory. Who does? The next guy, Martin Van Buren. In fact, so much so, they call him Martin Van Ruin. Now, this is where we get Jackson's legacy. Jackson's going to destroy the National Bank. We won't have anything similar to it until really during the Civil War and then afterward. Jackson epitomizes the style of politicians for decades. You're either a Jackson wannabe or you're a loser. In 1840, Van Buren runs for re-election. He's got no chance as the Democratic nominee. They call him Martin Van Ruin. Plus, Van Buren is a pretty boy. He is a New York City, bon vivant. I like the good life, a nice bottle of wine, cool-looking threads. I don't know if Van Buren, he might have a heart attack if he got dirt under his fingernails. So the Whigs, the guys who always lost to Jackson, they say if you can't beat him, join him. In 1840, the Whigs nominate this guy, whose picture you're going to see, William Henry Harrison. Old Tippecanoe, hero from the War of 1812. Governor of Indiana, a western state. And they run a campaign they call the Log Cabin and Hard Cider Campaign. They paint up Van Buren as this out-of-touch city boy who rides in horse-drawn carriages. And they have a little songs and slogans like, in white carriages he's no rider, but he can fight and drink hard cider.
I don't drink tea. What do you drink? Not tea.
Old Tippecanoe. They make a gigantic tin ball and they reel that in as their little stunt. Popular turnout for the 1840 election is higher than any election ever to that point, because the Whigs cash in on wannabe Jackson. Harrison wins. Now, Harrison at that time was the oldest elected president, 60-something years old. He had played up this, I'm just a fighting man kind of frontiersman. The fact is, he was remarkably well educated. He was a practicing doctor. So now all of a sudden, in spin control, he says, all right, I got to make people look that I'm smart now. So on March 4th, 1841, William Henry Harrison decides, I'm going to give a 2-hour speech. Show off, flex my vocabulary, show you how smart I am. It's a cold, nasty, rainy, windy, cold day. I ain't wearing no hat or coat. Can't look like a softie now. Remember the time your mom told you to put a coat on? And you didn't listen. William Henry Harrison gives his 2-hour speech, and the cold, nasty wetness gets a cold. The cold turns into pneumonia, and 31 days after taking office, he dies.
Oh my God! They killed Kenny!
Next guy who comes in, John Tyler from Virginia. Tyler, well, we'll get to him later on, but Tyler is going to become important because he does something Jackson never did. In 1836, as part of Manifest Destiny, go west, young man, go west, the Independent Republic of Texas, yeehaw, the Lone Star Republic, gets their independence from Mexico, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The whole Remember the Alamo deal. And Texas elected their president, a guy named Sam Houston from Tennessee, Jackson State. Sam Houston travels and says, Mr. President, we want you to add Texas in as a state. And Jackson, the tough guy who's not afraid of anything, says, nah, bro, I ain't doing that. No way. You nuts? Because Texas has slavery. And there's no way Jackson's afraid to touch that issue of adding a slave state. What does that tell you if Jackson's afraid to do it? So now, in 1845, in 1845, Tyler on his way out the door, he'll be the one who annexes Texas. The guy who comes after Tyler, a Democrat, James K. Polk, they call him Young Hickory. He's from Tennessee. Polk plays up this whole idea of, I want an independent treasury system. I don't want to go back to these Whig ideas of a national bank. You know who Polk beats in 1844? He beats Henry Clay again. Polk also makes a promise to annex Texas, which Tyler beats him to. So Polk says, I'll annex more territories. And we'll see with Polk. Polk plays up this idea of man of the people, Young Hickory. Back in the day, anyone could go to the White House when Polk was president. You simply knocked on the door, presented your card, and waited your turn. Later presidents, after Polk, the Whigs, they get their own wannabe Jackson Part 2. A guy named Zachary Taylor, hero from the Mexican War, old, rough, and ready. Zachary Taylor, who liked to brag, I never even voted before. Didn't even vote in his own election. There's supposed to be something about wannabe Jacksons who are Whigs. Zachary Taylor, we're going to find he dies while in office, and he probably was as tough as Jackson, but if you die before you can show everyone how tough you are, he's going to be in office when things really go south and the whole secession thing really kicks in big time. Fast forward to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln called himself the rail splitter. They played up the idea of the log cabin. He's a wannabe Jackson. The guy who comes after him, Andrew Johnson from Tennessee. The tailor from Tennessee. Everybody loves this quasi-man of the people ideal that Andrew Jackson did. Okay? Now, the other big thing that plays in is the next unit we talk about. We talk about antebellum reforms. And for you guys who are Latin students, ante, A-N-T-E, means before. Bellum means war. The reform movements prior to the Civil War. They get spiced up big time by Jackson juice. There is a French author, a guy who comes in, and his name is Alexis de Tocqueville. And while Jackson's president, Alexis de Tocqueville wants to write about American prisons. There was a commonly held belief that the best way to evaluate a society was look how they treat their prisoners. Instead, he gets blown away by how during the Jacksonian age, everybody's obsessed with equality, how Rich people dress down, poor people dress up, and you try to downplay class differences. So he writes a book called Democracy in America. And he marvels at how, like, religion in America is not an institution designed to keep people down, but religion becomes the big impetus, the force for reform movements and change. And we will see in upstate New York, central, northern, western New York, this new reform movement called the Second Great Awakening. Friends, yes, we're bringing back the idea of a Great Awakening, friends, but now it's more revivalism, more emotion. But now it's not just good enough to just be a good Christian, not sin. The idea is you're supposed to fight against sin and injustice and corruption and things that are bad, like booze and slavery. And we're going to see that this Jacksonian emphasis on the meaning of the common people adds a hot sauce dash to these movements. That and a lot more are going to bring us to what eventually becomes Civil War. Lastly, you ever see that movie, The Wolf of Wall Street? John, you cannot put any clips from Wolf of Wall Street in. I'll get fired. Okay? They don't call it The Wolf of Chestnut Street. Jackson's bank war changes America's finances forever. We no longer have Philadelphia and the Second National Bank as the financial center of America. Did I mention that Martin Van Buren, Jackson's Secretary of State and Vice President, he's a New Yorker? As a result of Jackson's bank war, the financial capital of the United States shifts from Philadelphia up to the city that never sleeps. So, until later, log off and put away your chromies, homies. I'll see you.